Okay, so this is the third session of the fourth seminar on security. We're still in the first third of the seminar, which is on the infant's internal world. And we have the great pleasure of hosting Marga Vicedo today. And I will introduce her, and then she will present both the Bowlby text and her own writing, which is always a gift when we're able to have a presenter discuss some of their own work on the subject. And there's really no one better to join us to talk about attachment theory today than Marga. So thank you so much for joining us. Marga Vicedo is a philosopher and historian of science. She's a professor at the University of Toronto, where she teaches and writes about the history of biology, psychology, and psychiatry since the turn of the 20th century. She's on the editorial board of numerous journals, including the Review of General Psychology and the Journal of the History of the Behavioral Sciences. And she's the author of two books, The Nature and Nurture of Love, From Imprinting to Attachment in Cold War America, and Intelligent Love, The Story of Clara Park, Her Autistic Daughter, and the Myth of the Refrigerator Mother. And I will drop the link in the chat to both of those books. And thank you so much, Marga. We'll have your presentation and then we'll open up for questions as we've done before. So thank you for joining us, and thank you everyone for coming.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Okay, because I couldn't see now where to unmute myself. But hi, everyone. I mean, first, obviously, I'm Marga. I want to thank Hannah and Wendy and other organizers for inviting me. It is really a pleasure to be here. And I want to say something before we start. As Hannah said last week, I'm not a clinician, I'm a historian. And if you had the chance to read the two pieces that overlap a little bit, but that I wrote, I wrote a lot on attachment theory, but the two pieces I selected for today, I come from the history of biology, philosophy, and history of biology. And the way I moved to attachment is because at some point I had written quite a bit about the history of animal research. And I was interested not only in the development of the history of biology, the history of evolution, genetics, and animal behavior, but on the use of ideas from those fields in other fields. That is, in the extrapolation of certain concepts or views to other areas, which included psychoanalysis, but also child development, and in my last book, as it was mentioned, the field of autism. So that's to situate myself and to explain that also, as you will see, probably because I come from philosophy, my work as a historian is quite analytical and also engages with, as the result of what I think I've learned in my historical research, I also engage attachment theory. And I mean, I'll say it openly, I'm quite critical of this theory, and I hope if some of you are not, that I'm really happy to engage in discussion of these issues. And on that note, I'm very bad at talking, looking at the slides, and then also looking at the chat. So I welcome interruptions at all levels. As you can notice, I have an accent. So if you don't understand what I'm saying, raise your hand. Or if you want a clarification of a concept as well. But just probably interrupt me directly, or I hope Wendy or Hannah can see your hands, because I'm not good at multitasking and looking at different places. So what I thought I'll do, because you have the paper by Bowlby, which is the foundation of all his views, and you read two short pieces of mine. The three things cover a lot. and it's impossible in the time we have to go in depth on all of that. So what I thought I would do is I prepared two short PowerPoint presentations, mainly so that you can see some pictures, which always helps. And also because they provide like a map or an overview of the main points that I've studied. And then I'll try to be brief so that then, you can ask me to focus on one part or another. I'll just sort of go over this as a way of mapping what I see like the history of attachment theory and the criticisms. Perhaps we'll finish after the history and then we'll look at the criticisms. But as you know, your topic for this course is security. And security is, of course, a huge word, like many of the ones we'll be discussing. And, the meaning has changed over time. But today, I think it's fair to say that it's deeply intertwined with attachment. And attachment, it's today, as I say there. Okay, let's look at you can see the slides, right? So I put very briefly the main claims. It claims an instinctual relationship between mother and infant, and we will talk about what that means. It postulates the need for continued and sensitive maternal care for the child's adequate emotional and psychological development. And it's very important that, those words are taken seriously. Attachment theory is not a theory that says that it is a good thing to have a nice mother. That is a given. It's a good thing to have a nice mother, a nice partner, and a nice dog. I mean, what it says is much, much stronger, is that maternal love is needed. It is essential, and that for adequate emotional and psychological development, meaning without it, you will have pathologies, okay? And the other thing, that as a mode of introduction is important to keep in mind is how successful this theory has become at all levels. Not only to explain the mother-infant bond, but to explain people's relationships with anyone, literally. I mean, just yesterday I went to drugstore here in Toronto. It's a chain, it's a huge drugstore. So in one section, it has a small section on books, mainly bestsellers. I counted the books. I usually don't even look at this section, but I look because I was walking inside since outside was so cold. But okay, there were 20 books, all of them, bestsellers, a couple about major figures in the entertainment world, a couple obviously about dieting and fitness. Out of 20, 2 of those books were on attachment. And they both said they were bestsellers. One of them had sold over 2 million copies. So this is huge. I mean, 2 out of 20, so this theory has become really, really very successful. So, oops, why is this not? Oh, okay, it wasn't moving, but hold on a second. Now, so why can't I move the slides? Can one of you do it? Oh, no, now, okay, yeah, sorry. Okay, so what I thought we would do, as I said, is that I'll just mention a couple of things about the historical context, and then we look briefly also at the early development of Bowlby's ideas. We look at the studies that he relied on to construct his theory, and then we look at the criticisms, right? But I will stop before all of that so that we have a chance to engage in discussion. So So the historical context is, I want to say just a couple of words because Hannah also talked about this last week. I mean, it's very important to keep in mind that we're talking about World War II, which actually witnesses the rise of child psychoanalysis and a lot of research in child development, because at the time there is a huge interest in what the war did to children, right? And there are also other events that I'll mention briefly. One is that there is also a shift, I think, in the focus in trying to explain human behavior in particular. There is a shift from focusing on intelligence and intelligence tests and cognition to talk about emotions, and what I call the sort of change from the mind to the heart. There is also a rise of interest in instincts, by which I mean the psychological instincts or psychoanalytic drives, but I mean biological instincts, and we'll see this too. And of course, there is the social context that, especially in the US, which is the context I know best, many women have gone to work outside the home and in factories to support the war effort. And after the war, they are asked literally to return to the house and stay in the house. And many of them said no. So there was, and you can see this in Bowlby also in England, a lot of concern about the disintegration of the family unit. And that context is very important to understand the success of attachment theory. As you know, there you have the main leaders of the field. John Bowlby, who is considered a theoretician, of Mary Ainsworth, who provided a lot of the observational and experimental work. So, okay, before we go to this, which is the presentation of Bowlby's major work, the 1969 edition of his book Attachment, and the cover is already quite revealing of his views. But I want to say a word about what happened earlier. And many of you probably know, and I'll just focus on two major publications. One of them we read it today. Because of the concern that I mentioned about what happened to children after the war, the World Health Organization, the WHO, wanted to have a study about what were the consequences for children who had been displaced or orphaned or otherwise affected by the conflict. And they asked Bowlby to carry out the research and produce a report. The report, was published in 1951. It's and then I put it earlier there, and it is about maternal care and mental health, which already tells you we're talking about the consequences of care or lack of it for pathology. So not, And in this report, Bowlby drew a very strong, you haven't read it, but very strong conclusions. I have here some of my notes, but this is one of the sentences that became very famous and controversial, is the one in which Bowlby says in this report that children needed, quote, the provision of constant attention night and day, 7 days a week and 365 days in a year, which is a pretty high, high demand. I mean, like Hannah said last week when talking about Winnicott and his views about the good enough mother, both attachment and the good enough mother are interpreted sometimes as, oh, they are pretty mild, just as long as you're good enough. The only thing is that when you read closely what they are claiming, being good enough is really difficult. right? So Bowlby is talking here about behavior, about emotions, and about the unconscious feelings. So 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 24 hours a day, a mother has to be thinking and responding to her baby, and any thoughts or any other activities already puts you in the category of not being a good mother. And perhaps briefly, I will also mention that because you see this in his article in 1958, how he thinks of the mother-infant diet in relation to what you can also call not only the health of the child, but the health of the nation. He says, the quote, "The proper care of children is essential for the mental and social welfare of a community. For when their care is neglected, as happens in every country of the Western world today, they grow up to reproduce themselves. Deprived children, whether in their own homes or out of them, are the source of social infection as real and serious as are carriers of diphtheria and typhoid." So I could say much more about this report, but we'll leave it there. As you can imagine, these are very strong claims that were not well received among many other scholars. And there were criticisms, after the report was published, the WHO received so many letters of complaint that it saw itself in the position of asking for a reassessment of the report. And in that reassessment, Bowlby declined to answer to his critics. The critics came from psychology, from sociology, from anthropology, including Margaret Mead already. And but Bowlby said he wasn't responding, but he asked Mary Ainsworth, who had been a collaborator at that point, to respond for him. And in the archives, you can see very clearly how Bowlby is not responding, but is telling Mary Ainsworth how to respond. So anyway, the WHO publishes this, I think, if I recall correctly, it's called something like Maternal Care, a reassessment of its effects, presenting all the criticisms to Bowlby's earlier report. So what happened? Well, so not much really, because by this point, Bowlby had already encountered, let's go back here, had already encountered ethology. Ethology, which was presented by Nico Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz as the science of animal behavior, and a science that was aimed to postulate that most social behavior, both in non-human animals and in human animals, was to be explained as a matter of social instincts. So Bowlby, when he encountered these ideas, he decided to sort of establish the foundation of his views on the mother-infant diet by appealing to ethological ideas. And, since I was asked to talk about the readings closely, and you've done them, and we can discuss them, let me introduce here the article we read, the 1958 report. So Mary Ainsworth answered the critics, mainly saying they misunderstood Bowlby. Bowlby, in the meanwhile, it's already going in the direction of appealing to biology to justify his views. And the first paper that he publishes, which will be a chapter and the foundation of the book that you have there, is the article we read today. And there you can see, we can discuss it later, but you can see that Bowlby actually is looking and reviewing what are the he says the mother-infant bond is accepted by everyone, and it's significant as well. And the only, in fact, that's the first sentence. He says, psychoanalysts are at one in recognizing the child's first object relations as the foundation stone of his personality. Yet there is no agreement on the nature and dynamics of this relationship. And then he does a review of the different views, Melanie Klein, Anna Freud, Winnicott, Spitz, and others. And he says, basically, briefly, that they are relying too much in the significance of food for the child, or the fact that the mother covers the infant's physiological needs, and they are not paying sufficient attention to the child's psychological or emotional needs. And then he says that, I think it's on page 365, he says he's going to present an alternative theory, which is that by taking the work of the ethologists, and he doesn't mention them by name, but it's Konrad Lorenz mainly, and he is going to postulate, 358. I have it here, 358. Let's see. It's dato situé yo. Yeah. He's talking about learning theories, and then he says, holding an opposite view are the ethologists, right? And then he introduces their views, and specifically their views on instincts, which are, not the concept of instinct that have been used in psychoanalysis, which is a translation of the word Trieb in German. He says the ethologists are talking about behavior, are talking about behaviors that are species specific, and that are fixed and immutable, and they are inherited. And those are the biological instincts. And then he claims that the same way that the ethologists have looked at those instincts in animals, he's identified in babies several behaviors like sucking, clinging, following, crying, and smiling that are instincts that help unite the mother with the infant, right? And there, although still in a footnote, I will talk more about it because Hannah mentioned the monkeys last week, and I thought, I need to talk about the monkeys. But in a footnote, he also refers to the work of Harlow. So I'll mention, and I will cover it in a minute. So basically, this is what he does. He does a complete shift. In fact, in his book, 1969, he will present his views on attachment as a new paradigm. He had read Thomas Kuhn, who had introduced the word paradigm, and he said, I'm presenting a new paradigm. And so in that new paradigm, like for many other psychoanalysts, the early experiences are determinant for a child's psychic development, but mother love is a biological need. And in 1969, he will say the mother-infant dyad, or what he calls the attachment system, because a little bit like we need to talk, what about an assemblage? I mean, Bowlby talks about this as a system. It's not the baby and the mother, it's the mother-infant system. He says it's a system designed by evolution, by natural selection, that meaning it's an adaptation, and that, developed in what he calls the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness. This is a central concept in evolutionary psychology today, Very few people know, I think, that it comes from Bowlby, but he's the one who introduced it. It's basically, he says, there is this early environment of hominid evolution, and in that context, there are certain, psychological systems that evolve the same way that, our anatomy or physiological traits evolve. And the attachment is one of them. Okay, these are very strong claims. I hope you're realizing. So what does he appeal to as evidence for these views, or to this new paradigm? One thing is what, deprivation studies, okay? Those are studies in which many different people have looked at children who were raised without mothers and had, or with maternal separation, maternal deprivation, and had seen that sometimes there were, sort of bad consequences, or the children were emotionally or psychologically scarred. The other thing that he appeals to is Conrad Lorenz's views on imprinting, Harry Harlow's experiments, and then Mary Ainsworth's research. So I'll briefly say a couple of words about all of those. Deprivation studies, there you have Anna Freud and the Hampstead nurseries, where many children went when London was being bombed. That's how they are pretty dramatic pictures that obviously these are children, and are very strong emotional and psychological stress. This is Renee Spitz, looking at one child in a nursery. And okay, so I don't know how much you know about these experiments or want to know. Like Spitz, for example, had carried work in a prison and in an orphanage somewhere in Mexico. He never revealed where the orphanage was. And what he concluded from these studies is that the babies raised by their mothers in the prison develop well, whereas their babies who were raised in an orphanage, where according to him, they had all the physiological needs covered and they were in a good environment in that sense, developed all sorts of psychical problems, emotional, psychological issues, and in fact, often they even died. So that's just one example of the sort of deprivation or separation, maternal deprivation or maternal separation studies that Bowlby appealed to them as evidence of his position. Then he also appealed to the notion of imprinting. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, have seen these pictures, because from his youth, there you have a young Konrad Lorenz in Altenburg, Austria, followed by ducks or gears. I mean, and you have all his life, you can see from youth to old age, he was doing these studies. So imprinting refers to, yeah.
Can I just ask quickly, sorry to interrupt. Do you think you could click the use slideshow at the top of the screen so that the images get a bit larger? It's hard to see the animals in that last one.
So how do I do that?
So I think if you click use slideshow.
Use a slideshow. Yeah, so what was
there we go, that's better. That's good.
Oh, okay.
Great.
I thought that's what you were seeing. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's okay. So yeah, I honestly wasn't sure whether you're seeing the same that I see. So, and I told you I'm bad at multitasking. So if I'm talking, it's difficult for me to pay attention to the other aspects of the screen. Anyway, so imprinting is the process whereby certain types of birds, only some species of birds, follow the first object after they hatch. The first object is usually the mother, right? But sometimes it could be an Austrian researcher, like in this case, they see Lorenz. So what happens is that if those birds don't follow the proper object, which is usually the mother, they will not develop the proper responses in adulthood. For example, when these birds grow up or grew up, they sort of perform like courting behavior towards Lorentz, obviously the wrong object if you want to reproduce. So the process of shifting or taking the mother away had very serious consequences for the bird's development. So Bowlby literally says that the relationship of the human infant with the mother can literally be called also an imprinting process. And he also uses other animal studies, specifically the studies of Harry Harlow, who is also super famous. I'm sure all of you knew he was working at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and he carried out research on rhesus monkeys, raising them on what he called surrogate mother machines. There you have them. One is made of wire, and the other has also a wire, but is covered by a cloth. The cloth is soft and it's warm. And what he did is put a bottle, I'm pointing to a bottle of milk, sometimes in the wire mother, sometimes in the cloth mother, and he timed how long the rhesus baby was in with one mother or the other, right? And what he discovered is that the rhesus monkeys spent most of the time with the cloth mother, right? And then he did all the other experiments that I mentioned briefly, because maybe Mary Ainsworth got the idea about the mother's a secure base from these experiments. And because what he did is he subjected the monkeys to certain things that made them afraid, right? Like here there is a teddy bear or some other objects. So, and he analyzed or he observed the response of the baby monkey. When the cloth mother was there in this, a strange situation, the monkey went to the cloth mother and, ventured sometimes to explore and then returned to the cloth mother. When there was the absence of the mother, the monkey, these images are very hard, I'm sorry, but obviously you can see the monkey there like literally, suffering into a ball. And these experiments were covered by the New York, he presented these experiments at his talk as the president of the American Psychological Association, and immediately, they went beyond the walls of academia, and they were presented. He wrote some poems. They were presented in the New York Times, and they became immediately part of the larger culture. So what is this experiment showed about mothers? I mean, often they are reported. I'm entering here, I put the criticisms apart, but I want to say a word about this because these experiments are often so poorly reported. Often you read that Harlow showed that babies prefer the mother offering comfort. And Bowlby on page 367, 366 of the reading you have for today, and on a footnote, he refers to Harlow's experiments, and he says these experiments suggest that the preferred model is the one which is the most comfy to cling rather than the one which provides food. So we need to be careful about the words we use, because preferred, well, did they prefer? It's important to keep in mind that the baby monkeys did spend most of their time with the cloth mother after they had eaten. after. Sometimes I read even in very famous books that these experiments reported that these monkeys prefer to stay with the cloth mother even when they risk starvation. This is really, how can I put it mildly? I don't want to say a bad word, but this is nonsense. I mean, any species or any individuals that didn't teach, they would be extinct now. So rhesus monkeys would not exist if they prefer to be with a cloth mother than eating. So it is a different thing, yeah, that they show more of, if you want to call it, attachment to the cloth mother, because after eating they spend more time with it. So perhaps the experiments did show that comfort was, important to them in addition to food. And sometimes the experiments are also reported as saying that Harlow showed that the babies need their mothers. Well, if you read the paper by Harlow, this is not what he concludes. What Harlow concludes is that if, I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, I'm saying as a matter of fact, what he puts in his paper and in his talk is that if comfort is important, well, that's great news for males of his generation, because the males could also, and the fathers could also provide comfort. And I want to show you, oops, okay, I made this big, but now I cannot, sorry. Here, this, I don't think it's in my book. I mean, or maybe it is, but the quality, certainly not in color. This is interesting to me because of the way that some women also read Harlow at the time, more correctly than historians later on or other scientists, because they did read the last sentence of Harlow, that if comfort is all a baby rhesus monkey needs, then anyone could provide that comfort. And a group of women who were having, invited him to talk to their association, sent him this poster, which is in his archives, and where you can see a lady looking like Hollywood style with a monkey around her saying, "And after motherhood, what?" So for many of these women, they saw his results as sort of liberating them from being the only ones who could provide the maternal care or the care necessary for infant development. Okay, so, well, the experiments are open to different interpretations, but the monkeys keep growing and keep, and then some surprises came up, because the monkeys who had been raised with these mother surrogates then did things like this. When it came to behaviors that many of us, even, at the top of our head, if we were asked to think, I sometimes ask my students, what do they think are two of the most sort of biologically based behaviors or instinctual behaviors? Well, given that they are needed for, survival and reproduction, one would say sex and maternal care, right? Okay, well, this is what the monkeys did. Having been raised with the mother machines, they tried to copulate in the wrong place. And they actually, the ones who by artificial inseminations conceived babies, sometimes, they were brutal to them and often would have killed them if they hadn't been taken away. So, apparently this confirmed, for Bowlby was sort of an aha moment. It turns out that, we need mothers after all. And we'll see later, because there is a twist to this story. But, I just want to mention how famous Harlow's experiments were over the year, at the time and over the years, because they made it to all sorts of places. And finally, before I take a break from talking and hear from you, and we move on to the criticisms, Bowlby appealed to the work of Mary Ainsworth. And Mary Ainsworth was a US Canadian. She was born in the US. She came to actually the University of Toronto, then moved to England, where she answered an ad and started working with Bowlby, and then moved to Africa, where she carried out some observational work on the mother-infant relationships. And then she moved to Baltimore and did not write this research up for another 10 years, but eventually did publish the observational work interpreted through attachment theory that Bowlby was developing, and presented it as supporting Bowlby's views. And this is a picture. And I think, and you read in the papers that I gave you that later on, she developed also the strange situation procedure, which is an experimental setup to analyze what children do when the mother comes to the lab, then leaves in certain intervals, and depending on how the child reacts to the absence and the return of the mother, the psychologists measure the degree of attachment and they categorize it in different ways, right? So all that work, all the work, I'm not telling you my views except to say this is the work that Bowlby appealed to support attachment theory, and to conclude that mother love is essential and determinant for children's psychological and emotional healthy development. So not good, not it's nice, nobody denies that. I have a nice mother, it's wonderful to have her. I'm sure by the views of attachment theories, I'm very attached to my mother, but this is not the question, how nice it is to have a good mother. The question is whether that is essential and determinant for a child, and whether without it, the child will develop pathologies. Okay, I think this is all for this part. I'll take your question, I take a break, and then I have another little set of slides to look at the criticisms. Let me see if I can. I need to
Great. Thank you so much, Marga. That was very clear and helpful. There's one question in the chat already, but if anyone has questions, feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand. So Karen Slater asked, can you distinguish a little bit between the strange situation and Harlow's experiments? Yeah, the Harlow, the experiment that I showed you a few pictures is done, just to assess, well, if the children, well, I don't want to confuse the rhesus babies with children, although Harlow and others do think that one can extrapolate from certain species to others. Actually, this is a bigger question. I don't think you can. But anyway, what Harlow did is put these, babies in a strange room, or in a strange room in the sense that it is a room in the lab, and, bring in different objects that the rhesus monkeys were afraid of, and then try to see how the rhesus monkey reacted, right? And these were not the only experiments carried out by psychologists at the time, in which there were other psychologists who were also doing similar things with children, like, well, how do children react to being separated from parents or being in a strange room? It's actually a pretty big theme in Cold War science. There is a historian who has an article about all these strange rooms during the Cold War. But since, Ainsworth and Bowlby did know Harlow and corresponded with him, I think it's very likely that at least part of the inspiration to do the strange situation procedure
where children came from these original experiments from Harlow. But of course, they are very different. I mean, they are different, first of all, because some are with monkeys, the others with children. And secondly, because in Harlow, you have objects that make the monkeys afraid. In the SSP, what you have is there are several timed episodes in which the child goes with the mother to their lap, and then the mother leaves, and then the mother returns, and then the child is with the person or psychologist from the lab. So they're, the child is not left in a strange room with objects that make him afraid or her.
Great. And we have a question from Tulika. Can you see the chat as well?
Yeah, now I can see it. Depending on how I show the slide, I see one thing or the other. Yeah, could you explain a bit more about monsters and punitive mothers? Absolutely. But since I have it as part of the criticism, I told you there is another twist. I'll show you in the other slides. And what's the significance of Uganda? Did Ainsworth conduct any experiments there? Well, that depends on what you called experiments and what you called observations, right? Because this is interesting, and I mentioned in one of my articles that it's a little bit sort of ironic, because what brought attachment theory to another level of success and in my opinion, as I say in one of an articles, was the introduction of the a strange situation procedure, right? And why? Because, if you have to analyze how children are raised, or mothers and fathers and the community treat children by doing anthropological ethnographic work, you need to learn languages. You need to go and live in a place that is usually not up to the comforts of your, where you come from, for several years. If you do the SSP, you can have the results of experiments within days. So, and I put a graph in my, one of my papers. If you look at the publication rate on these experiments, it just shoots through the roof. Because, so to me, I mean, this seems a simple explanation, but it is certainly not the whole explanation, but it is part of the explanation that, as I said there, when we were talking about the development of science, we not only have to take into account different views about mothers, different views about children, but different views about science. After World War II, the rise of experimental science, the rise of experiments in psychology, it's really, modeled after what historians have called scientism. That is, the need to look like the physical sciences. There is a hierarchy in the sciences. Physics is the queen, perhaps chemistry, biology, and then psychology. So psychology has always, in fact, at the University of Toronto, when I came here and I mentioned psychology among the social sciences, they told me, oh, you cannot do that. Psychologists do not like to be put with the social sciences. They are with the natural sciences. So doing experiments is very important. But at the same time, look how paradoxical it is that, attachment theory also wrote on the cocktails of ethology. Ethology is a field to study animal behavior that is predicated on the need to understand animal behavior in the field, in context. Ethology develops in contraposition to the learning theories who were doing experiments with rats in the lab. And Konrad Lorenz says, this tells us nothing about the animals. We need to go and see them and observe them, if not in the wild, but at least in the field or somehow in context. So attachment theorists are appealing to ethology, but eventually, and ethology is huge in this period. I would like to convey to you how famous these people were. I mean, Conrad Lorenz was like a movie star and came to the US and was on television. And if you want a sign not only of their sort of fame, but also their respect even in the scientific community, is that in 1973, ethology, which is saying we need to study animals in the field and the animal behavior is the result of social instincts, wins the Nobel Prize in physiology and medicine. This is the one and only time before or after that the Nobel Prize went to a field. The Nobel Prize usually is given for a particular discovery. Here is given to the field. So to Konrad Lorenz, Nico Tinbergen, and Carl von Frisch. So this gives you an idea of how much, say, in attachment theory is based on ethological research, how much that could do for attachment theory. But also this is a long way trying to answer your question because, what Ainsworth is doing, for example, what Konrad Lorenz is doing is substituting the mother with those, the pictures that you saw, that he is guiding the ducks or the geese. So that's presented as a paradigmatic study in ethology, which is saying we need to observe. But is that observation or is that experimentation? Because you are taking out one factor and you're introducing a scientist instead of the mother. So that, to me, is an experiment like any other, or like many others. In the case of Ainsworth, what she does is she goes to these families, she has an interpreter, and she is asking the mothers about the relationship with their children while the children are around. So what she is doing is taking notes about the comings and goings of the children, and she is asking the mother about her child rearing practices, which are told to her through an interpreter. And also, these were a group of mothers who had been offered clinical services or sort of medical services in exchange for participating in the study. And she writes up the results or the interpretation of these results more of a decade later. I mean, this is not to say that it is useless. I think her work in Uganda is interesting, but it is to say that we're not talking about observations, sort of unmediated observations that then several people write down and they're controlled. We're not talking about an experiment. I mean, it's sort of a mixture of both, right? Okay, so I've seen many people list their attachment style in their online dating profiles right alongside. Yeah, that's at the label that it should be, at the label of their astrological sign. Yeah, so long as they can say that it's secure. I mean, honestly, yeah, to be fair and nice and as nice as possible. I mean, all these, I think attachment theory rests on very shaky foundations. But the work that goes beyond Bowlby and Ainsworth and talks about attachment styles in adults and for things like dating, that I would just put at the label of utter nonsense. I mean, this is, that goes contrary to all we know about humans in psychology, about brain plasticity, about the importance of one's history and development. I mean, to categorize people in these fixed boxes where you're this and that, and I mean, what can I say? From a scientific point of view, I think there is no evidence to do this. So, to what do you attribute the success of attachment theory within pop culture? Why do you think people identify? Well, a little bit, I think, I mean, these are very complex issues, right? I mean, I don't have the full answer. If I had it, I probably would write the bestseller too. I mean, but as a historian of science, there have been many scientific theories that lasted for decades, even centuries. And one day they were shown to be without a base, right? But it is a very complex issue. I mean, we haven't even talked about the criticisms of attachment theory, which is a long PowerPoint. But to me, I mean, it is an interesting question. How comes that the theory that you are welcome to disagree and tell me your reasons, but I see as resting on such a poor foundation, has become so successful and continues to be so in the larger culture, is a very complex issue, right? And but part of it, I think, is what Hannah was talking about last week, is that some of these views seem very mild and commonsensical, right? All of us had parents, and sometimes we were happy with them or we're unhappy, and sometimes our mothers were nice, sometimes they weren't so nice, and sometimes we feel we still have some, if you know, traumas, issues from our childhood, and all of us think that affected us. That's in itself an assumption, I would say. You probably, that is very prevalent in our society. For example, the assumption that what happened to us in early childhood, regardless of whether it is the mother or other traumatic events, is so determinant for your life later on. That is very prevalent. Almost everyone I know believes that. If you ask me again, you know, being a philosopher and wanted to analyze everything critically, is how much evidence do we have for this? I don't know. I can think about myself. If you want to understand who I am, if you want to understand how I act today, and I look back, I can assure you honestly that what happened to me these past 4 years was more important and determinant than what happened to me the first 4 years of my life. Now, maybe that's not the case for everyone, right? Because, you know, some people have major illnesses 4 years ago. Some people have major illnesses when they were 3 years old. But this is the point that I'm trying to make, that I think the diversity and variability among human beings, among experiences, and the changes through our life histories are completely evaporate when you talk only about early experiences being determinant and people being divided in 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 categories. I mean, I think what we know about the human brain, what we know about resilience, what we know about plasticity, really doesn't support that view of humans. So, but that still doesn't. So why is it so appealing? Well, I think because in part we still have this view that early experiences are determinant. In part, the world is very complex and diverse, and human beings, you know, we need to find a way of, it happens in biology, we categorize the species in genus, and it happens in many other fields. We need to find ways of organizing a little bit the complexity, diversity, variability of the human and social world. So theories that come to us with a very easy to understand mapping, and with these categories that are sort of seem very user-friendly, well, that's very appealing, right? I mean, I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. If I could categorize each one of them as unattached or, you know, boy, Instead of that, I've given up on, well, no, I haven't given up on them, but what I mean is understanding each other is very difficult. And these theories, like, you know, a little bit like horoscope. Well, it depends the day you were born, and it tells you it is a fixed quantities. They are easy to understand, they are predictive, and they help you sometimes blame someone else, in this case, our mothers. Do you know how relaxing it is? If I could blame all my shortcomings on my mother, boy, that would be like wonderful. So I don't know. What I'm saying is a little bit at the top of my head, but having reflected on this very important but very difficult question to answer. Why is it that some theories that are more complex and that really are, in my opinion, have a larger scientific base, are not popular, and other theories, attachment and others, which are for which I can see a lot of faults or shortcomings, become very popular? If you have the answer, give it to me. Yeah.
So there's a question in the chat, and it sounds like there's a lot to come maybe in the criticisms of attachment theory section. So we'll just go over this one question and then we can move into that and come back. But there's a question about your thoughts on Beatrice Beebe's work, which is more contemporary than the examples that you went through. On the microanalysis of the, you know,
okay, I'll look at it. Let me read quickly the other two. Could you think through why intentionality? Yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah, people are asking that I talk about. Yeah, I don't know that work well, but there is a lot of work, even from earlier on, trying to use, like, this comes also from ethology, trying to use the camera, right? Trying to do very, very detailed analysis or taping of the movements of the child and the mother and their responses. Yeah. But I cannot comment or tell you what I think about these particular studies because I don't know them well. I will look into them, but okay. But I mean, maybe you can think whether from the criticism you can see what I can think when it comes to focusing only on the mother-infant diet. Let me put the other PowerPoint, but I have to open it. And in my screen, maybe now I don't see it. Give me a second. Okay, yeah, I need to close the first one and open the second one. How are we doing? It is 2. And now I need to go. And I have to say share screen. And I need to say, like before. Are you seeing it big now? Well, okay.
Not yet. If you click use slideshow.
I have to click what?
Use slideshow at the top. Yeah, right there.
Oh, okay. Sorry, it's because I don't see well, so I have a small laptop and then I have a big screen. Okay, now?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, so the criticisms. Well, briefly. One, you remember, I'm going to look at what he appealed to. He appealed to deprivation studies. So there were a lot of critics saying, well, deprivation studies, you cannot go from deprivation studies where children are deprived from much more than mother love. You know, children who are in an orphanage sometimes were left there because they were ill, because they were neurodivergent. Imagine an orphanage in Mexico at the time. So because they had issues that the parents couldn't deal with, So these babies are deprived, or children are deprived of much more than mother love. They are deprived of siblings, they are deprived of a school, they are deprived of the father, they are deprived of a lot of sensory stimulation, sensory deprivation, because, yeah, they were in a good place, but it's not that people were playing with them. So you cannot extrapolate, this was one criticism from those studies, to studies about mother-infants in daily life. So another criticism, I'm going to read them very quickly, and then you can ask me about the ones that you're interested in, okay? Then the other criticism is that you cannot use the concept of imprinting to talk about humans. It only applies to some species of birds, and even there, it was later much criticized by other zoologists. And another major criticism, one that I have put and developed extensively in a very long article, is that when we are talking about the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, whatever you're saying is highly, highly or totally speculative. Because look, human evolution is difficult to document. Well, I think it has been clearly established and documented, but it's a historical science. It relies on the remains of the fossil record. It's already sometimes difficult to establish with certainty certain things about the anatomy and physiology, about the emotions and psychology, which don't leave fossil records. Whatever you're saying about earlier, humans is really on the realm of speculation. That doesn't mean it's wrong. I mean, sometimes we advance through speculation, but what you have to do is recognize that you're talking about, something that you're positing, but you cannot claim that's how it happened, right? So another major criticism is that Bowlby quoted selectively from Harlow's experiment, and he only quoted experiments that supported his views. And this goes to the issue of the punitive mothers. So what happens? Harlow continued other experiments with monkeys, and he wanted to disentangle this thing. I mean, a little bit, as I said, about deprivation experiment, deprivation in children. Children in orphanages lack much more than mothers, right? And so did the monkeys that Harlow raised with the mother machines. So at some point, he decides to raise baby rhesus monkeys with other monkeys. And what he concluded, again, these are very complex experiments, and we haven't even discussed the issue of whether we can extrapolate from rhesus monkeys to humans, which Harlow thought yes, Bowlby thought yes, many people think yes. If you ask me, I think no. But what Harlow says about rhesus monkeys is that when he did these experiments with baby rhesus monkeys raised with friends or only with mothers, in the case of having friends, these monkeys develop, let's say, perfectly well afterwards. Okay, so I'm the same. I mean, I didn't put a picture of the punitive mothers, but I tell you what, that story is also quite interesting. So these punitive mothers eventually had babies again through, again, artificial insemination. And what happened was quite interesting, because these mothers who had been really brutal, even murderers to their first babies, it turns out to the second babies, they were perfectly loving mothers. So what does this show? Well, if nothing else, the complexity. The complexity that, we are not in one category or the other. And that sometimes even just the experience of having had a baby with limited and difficult contact maybe taught these mothers to behave in a nicer way the second time. So this is how complex rhesus monkeys are, not to mention humans. Okay, and the other major criticism that I'm going to focus on, because it is major, and because he didn't address it, and because it has continued to this date, and it is covered in one of the articles I gave you, is that Bowlby or attachment theory to this day, although many theoreticians of attachment theory today will deny this, but the evidence is out there. They don't recognize the diversity of child rearing practices around the world. This is a criticism that Margaret Mead, I mentioned, have put immediately after Bowlby presented the WHO report. And by that time, she had done already quite a bit of work about childhood and childhood in other cultures. So what she challenged is the universalistic claims of attachment theory. Because again, Bowlby didn't say, well, in British society or in the Western world or in the US and Canada and England, it seems to be that mothers act this way and children develop this way. Well, what he says is that the attachment system is universal. And that's why it has been the result of a process of evolution by natural selection. So Mead criticized that he was ignoring data from other societies, showing that children who were, raised by people other than the mothers did not develop any pathology. And, also the view that separation from the mother always led to irreversible damage. I'm going to go, so basically what she said is that Bowlby had committed the sin of reification by giving the Moors of his own culture the status of universal behavior and positing a biological underpinning. So she called, if we want to talk, she was very interested in childhood, but she said it needs interdisciplinary and cross-cultural studies. So what happened to this challenge? Absolutely nothing. I mean, Mead published these views, and in his book, 1969, Bowlby, the whole book mentions the word anthropological once, and mentions Mead only in a footnote to say Margaret Mead has misinterpreted my views, but he never answered her criticisms. So, though the criticisms, I'm going fast because I want us to go to the discussion, were very, very sort of important and fundamental, because he was accusing him of not having enough evidence for his claims. So since Margaret Mead, many other anthropologists have raised a similar objection, right? I mean, very recently, some Canadian psychologists at UBC published a very influential paper where they said that, a lot of psychological research that talks about, not about attachment in general, that talks about human behavior, human emotions, and in general, is actually based on a very limited number of participants that all come from what they called weird psychology, which is from countries which are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So there has been in the last 20 years or so a huge challenge to a lot of psychological research. In the case that we're talking about, I will focus on similar challenges without using first this acronym to attachment theory. I think it's very important, the work of David Lancy. I mentioned all these people in the article you read, but here you have their faces and their books, because he, in his book, not only he's done work in different cultures, but he did sort of a meta-analysis. He reviewed over 200 ethnographic studies from the Mesolithic to the present, to see whether attachment had always been present. And he said that this is not the case, that in most of these cultures what parents are trying to do is not to attach. Why? To a great extent, as you can imagine, because this didn't happen in the time of my grandmother because of the high rate of infant mortality. So, I mean, there is chronic illnesses, there was other things that if parents or mothers in particular were attaching so strongly to a baby from the moment of birth, this would be really distressful. That's one of the factors. There are also the cultural factors that in many of these communities, they don't identify personhood or selfhood at the moment of birth. Sometimes, the babies have to develop for a period of time until they understand that it's already a person. So attachment is not a universal, according to Rolancy, as Bowlby postulated. The other criticism coming also from cross-cultural psychologists and anthropologists is that different cultures have different views about what it is to be a good child. But attachment theory has certain assumptions about what a good child is, not only what a good mother, but they focus on, the adults are always the ones that attach to the baby. The interactions are mostly dyadic, meaning one-to-one, and based on verbal communication. And, the infant's perspective has priority, and the adult or the mother has to respond in a sensitive way to the views of the children. But as these cross-cultural psychologists point out, this view of children really happens in, weird societies, which they say is less than 5% of the world's population. So I think, what time is it? I think we can come back. Oh no, we have time. So this is just an overview of different studies that have, challenged the view of the mother and of the baby that attachment theory has presented. Whereas, it's not that parents in these societies, or mothers in particular, are focused on responding 24 hours a day to the child. And this is, for example, emphasizing the work which comes from many anthropologists, but it was published by Robert Levine at Harvard and many of collaborators and colleagues. It also emphasizing the work of cross-cultural German psychologist Heidi Keller, who has done work in Germany, but also in different African settings. And for example, in this community where the caregivers are often not the adults and the relationships of the children are polyadic. And another related criticism is that in studies, even in psychology, not only in psychoanalysis or in child development, but even in psychology, psychologists have paid very little attention to the role of siblings. So, and to the role of siblings in cooperative childcare. And one example I mentioned in the papers you read is the work of, I love this work of, no, because she's a great writer. So the work of Alma Gottlieb, who published this book I mentioned in my papers among the Bank people in Africa, where their babies from very early on don't stay with the mother, but are passed among other children while the mothers work. Now, as you know, if you had, even if you don't have babies, if you have nephews or nieces, babies are a handful. So they are a lot of work, they cry, and, they are not always the beautiful, loving, as they are beings that they are often represented. Sometimes they are ill, I don't know. So what happens here to make the babies attractive to the older children? The mothers really engage in aesthetic practices that make the children more appealing. And you can see how they groom them in ways see the face of this baby, that they are made sort of like cute or nice and sort of aesthetically pleasing. So this is also from her book, from Alma Gottlieb, and this is, you can see it from very early on, the babies are carried and taken care of, but all the children who are not always siblings, the babies are passed about the children of the community. This is from another major cross-cultural psychologist, Barbara Rogoff. She has published many books. She specializes in Central America. And this is from her book about Mayan culture. And that you can see in the pictures from her book, that almost every child who is barely grown up enough to walk is carrying in the back or on the front another child, a baby. So, and this is sort of from Kela, and also an anthropologist from India, Nandita Chowdhury. They made this chart showing that in many different cultures, there are all different combinations. It could be one adult and one child, many adults and one child, one adult and many children, many adults and many children. So there are many different ways that children are taken care of from early childhood. And the way in which societies and children are taken care of, it also comes through the drawings, not surprisingly, that they do. And this is, for example, how children draw their families in Berlin. You can see pretty much mom and dad and the child, one or two children. Well, there's only one that there are three separated entities. Here's mom, here's dad, and here's the child. Different individuals that form pretty much the nuclear family. These are how the village draws the same children, the same age they draw. Most of the here are not separated. Do you see it? On top of each other, next to each other, in circles, literally all together. They are not two people who are adults and the child, or mom and dad and the boy and the girl. It's a completely different show that as Keller and others who have written, but Keller has written a lot about this community. The caregivers are often not adults. The interactions are not dyadic. And the children are also not the ones who lead, but they are educated from very early on to follow the adults' lead. Because if in Western society, at least in the US and probably Canada too, and many countries in Europe, we educate children for self-reliance, for independence. In many of these communities, they educate their children from very early on to defer to the adults and to put the relationship with the others ahead of the individual development. So because of that, not only the mothers don't try to attach, is that they actively try to discourage the attachment to them, because they value that, their children are related and trust and depend on each other. So this view of, interdependence, of intergenerational trust, of respect for the others and socialized to group expectations is very contrary to many of our views about child rearing. So I think to conclude is that, that what these anthropologists are calling is to recognize the cultural assumptions embedded in attachment theory. And sometimes attachment theories today do work on other cultures. In fact, they've taken the SSP to other cultures and they carry out their experiments there. But these anthropologists critique is deeper. It's saying, well, it's not just, when you are adopting these instruments, these measurements, these categories, these already assume certain views of science, of mothers, of children, and you cannot just so easily, bring it from one context to the other. So, because a lot of the cultural assumptions are already embedded there. So basically, that we need to take culture seriously. And I put the cover of some of the more recent books, that these are all collections of articles. So these are not the 4 or 5 people I mentioned before. These, each one of these books has at least 15 articles from different anthropologists working on different cultures, calling for the same place, for the same thing, which is that we just need to take culture seriously, not only in general, but also in child development, and specifically in studies of attachment. Some of these critics reject attachment theory completely. Others say we need to recognize, as that book says, the different phases of attachment. Others say we need to reconsider it and sort of take in their cultural perspectives. And this is the book which I participated to, but it's the cultural nature of attachment. And I'll leave you with, so basically I've said this already. Parents are not always trying to raise secure children, as security is defined in attachment. The parents often try not to attach, and shared care is common, and in many cultures it doesn't lead to any pathology. And I'll leave you with some pictures of other communities where you can see the same thing. Okay, enough of my part.
Thank you so much, Marga. So that was fantastic, really covered a lot in the second half. So we have questions and comments in the chat. I'll try to synthesize a few. And people feel free to raise your hands if you want to ask them directly. So there was one comment about from Samuel Catlin that I'll try to turn into a question, which is whether you see the kind of scientifically questionable substitution of one species for another, so studying the rhesus monkeys and believing that to be directly applicable to a human population, whether that kind of paves the way for the universalism of knowledge produced by and for and about populations from so-called weird countries from the West to speak for a kind of global human relations. Is the substitution of species sort of related to this universalism of the Western subject in some way?
Yeah, let me see. This is the comment by Samuel Catlin.
Yes.
Yeah, let me read it too to make sure before I answer that I understand it well. The problem seems to be clinched at least in part by his leap from other species to human beings. You can make the claim about other species. This makes the argument potentially universal. Yeah. Look, if you want to claim a biological base, which sometimes is the phrase we use, but which is meaningless. What does it mean that there is a biological base for Y and X? Of course, there is a biological base for everything because we're biological beings, right? So we are not made of. But since Bowlby's claims were more specific and more were that that the attachment system is the result, is an adaptation, he says, right? And which means it's the result of evolution by natural selection. And note that this doesn't mean that it is adaptive today. Being an adaptation is a historical claim. It means something has been the result of that process. But of course, if you can appeal to other, you can say that it's universal, and in other species it also happens. Then the probability of that being biological is higher. Right? It's not completely necessary. There are, some things that are, the result of evolution by natural selection, and they are genetically based. And they only happen in certain populations or in certain parts of a population. So it's not completely necessary. And there are many other things that are universal and they are not biologically based, right? But it does increase the chances. That's why he is doing it. Saying, look, it has to be biologically based. It has to be that, biology has made us that, evolution has made us that way, because it happens universally, which the anthropologists contested, but it also happens in other species, But, in other species, I mean, I didn't mention this, but do you know how many species of monkeys there are? And do you know the many different ways in which they raise their... So the variety and variability is also quite extensive, right? I mean, okay, and this is more general than about attachment, but that's why I'm also quite skeptical about all these extrapolations from other species, right? And I don't know why it is so accepted when it comes to humans. I mean, let's say that you wanted to learn about, let's say, I don't know, lions. And then you go and buy a book about lions, and when you open the first page, it starts talking about monkeys. Well, I'm pretty sure you would think of returning the book because, you want it. But when it comes to humans, we don't even blink. There are whole chapters in psychology books about humans that they are talking about humans, and then all they talk about is about other species. Well, why? Why? I mean, are we assuming a uniformity? I mean, are we ignoring the extensive evidence about the significance of ecological factors or cultural factors? I mean, other species also have cultures. I mean, I don't mean culture only in books and computers, you know what I mean? Are we ignoring the different social structures of different species? Why do we extrapolate? Why do we find it? This is another why that I find difficult to understand. Why have we become so accustomed to think about humans through other animals that we don't even find it problematic? I find it very problematic, right? And if you look, I mean, what we do is we jump from one species to the other, right? I mean, we used to compare a lot ourselves to chimpanzees. Then we discovered that chimpanzees, well, it turns out they are not as nice as we thought because they engage in infanticide and they do other things that we don't like. Well, now we compare ourselves to the bonobos because they are loving and they have a lot of sex. I mean, if it wasn't because we're supposed to be serious, it's almost a little bit a joke. I mean, we seem to have also this desire to try to explain ourselves in simplistic ways, and one of those simplistic ways is by looking at other species and extrapolating in a legitimate ways. That does not mean that we shouldn't look at other species. Of course, we're also the result of an evolutionary process, and we have separated from other species, and we are related to them in many ways. So I'm not against comparative psychology or looking at other species. All I'm saying is the simplistic extrapolation from one species to the other. That's what I find problematic. This was a long answer.
It was a good one. We have a couple more questions and then we can wrap up. So there's a question from Lewis that anyone can feel free to respond to either in chat or out loud, and also you, Margaret, as well. Lewis says, I'm working with an adoptee and just started to comb the literature in that area. I stumbled on The Primal Wound, which many have revered as a resource. It's interesting to think about it in the context of what Marga is saying here, essentialism/determinism of early experiences versus non. So does anyone have suggestions for discussions of adoption experience that swing the other way? and maybe you are familiar with that literature, Margot, or maybe someone in the group is. So anyone
I'm
who
not familiar with
has
the primal
resources.
mode, so if you want to say what the main thesis is, I am familiar with the literature on the history of adoption and also how, I mean, adoption, and I recommend the work, for example, of Ellen Herman, who is a fantastic historian of science. And there is an attachment theory influenced, maybe for the better in some cases, adoption practices, because adoption practices have shifted through the years depending on what we think the children need, right? And they move from people adopting children when they were a few years old, just to see whether the child was well or not, to adopting them as early as possible so that there is no break in this mother-infant bond. Yeah.
Great.
I mean, I don't know if the person who put the comment wants to say something more about this book, or I don't know.
I don't have much to add. It's really, I just opened the book a couple of days ago, and I haven't thought about this area at all. So I appreciate those resources, though.
Yeah. Well, the one thing I can tell you, which is beyond, well, no, not beyond my expertise, because I read a lot about these topics, is that because we live in a society that has the mother-infant diet so much at the center, and we think if there is, you can watch all the movies still today or series, it's unbelievable, sooner, I mean, if you see a procedural where somebody is a serial killer or just a killer, usually is a guy, right? That's another assumption. But sooner or later, you will see that, well, in childhood, there was a mother-infant broken bond. I mean, the killer was abandoned by the mother or was raised in an orphanage. But so this is a very prevalent notion in the popular culture. But so there is, what I've encountered is that this produces a lot of anxiety in fathers and mothers and of people who are raising children or people who adopt children. I don't mean this as a scientific statement, but from my experience of all the things I read about children and different ways of raising children, if there is one thing that has struck me as astonishing, is the children's resilience. So this view that it's also an assumption of attachment theory, that the baby is so fragile that without certain maternal care of a very specific type, the child will sort of derail his or her emotional development. I think there is plenty of evidence that there are many different ways of raising children. There are many different ways of being a child and being an adult and selfhood, and we are accepting neurodivergent. And if I had to give any practical advice, it's just relax and enjoy your child, because it's, I mean, all these scary theories only make all of us very anxious.
There's two questions that I'm going to try to combine into one about the reification of the Western experience or Western kinship. So if attachment theory operates as a colonial discourse, and this is from Guy, making strong claims about the personhood of the implicitly Western white infant, it erases the personhood of more marginal figures. Can you say any more about who suffers as a result of attachment theory, who is left out, and what the excluded element might be?
Who suffers? I mean, I think all. I mean, I think the mothers suffer because the expectations put on mothers through these theories are unreachable. There is no way you can. I mean, remember that it was not about doing the right behavior or having the right conduct. It's about having the right sentiment and about having the right unconscious feelings and thoughts So I don't know you, but I don't know a single mother who once in a while, I mean, my mother, who I think is a wonderful mother, had 5 children, told me that sometimes, I mean, she was so overwhelmed, she felt like either jumping off the window or throwing one of us through the window. I mean, this is completely normal. None of us thinks twice about my mom being a bad mother. I mean, like many parents, she did what she could, and I, you know, so it's you know, this who is suffering is the mothers who really and if it is the fathers too. I mean, there are people raising children who have such high expectations put on them that cannot meet them. I also think the children, because the children are, we have a vision of a child who is expected to develop in certain ways. And when they don't develop in those ways, you know, we find that the child is failing and the mother is failing, right? That's why I cover in my book on, this is Clara Park, the challenging of this, right? And the vision that I think that we have about mothers and children, society for not recognizing the diversity of practices in the world, and not only recognizing it, but celebrating it. And even our views about mental development, which is, you know, one of the reasons why I title Intelligent Love, my book about Clara Park, is because it's been often the intellectual mothers, the ones who were blamed more often, because it's, well, mothers who have any academic interest or even intellectual interest or any desire to do something else but being with the child, those are already potentially bad mothers. You know, and I think this is in part because we also establish this disconnect between emotion and cognition. And we think, as Bowlby said, the good mothers are the natural mothers. There is a quote in the article, you know, one of his articles was, he says, the ones who do things without thinking. That's it, as you know, as Hannah said from Winnicott too last week, by the time the mother has children, it's already a good mother or a bad mother, depending on sort of her emotional and psychological makeup determined in childhood. So naturally, the mother has to act in certain ways. But why couldn't you be an intelligent mother who's actually trying to understand your child through your intelligence and trying to help your child find her place in the world, not only through your love, but through your cognitive abilities? What's wrong with that? I mean, this was a mother who was demonized because she was taking notes on her child and she was trying to understand her. Well, you know, what's wrong with trying to understand your child if it is a vehicle also to understand her complex, in this case, her daughter was autistic, her complex psychological makeup. So, I mean, I actually think a lot of people suffer, which is one of the reasons why, as Hannah said it last week, these are theories that seem very innocuous, but the stakes are very high. And the people who suffer as a result of these ideas are many and profoundly. I mean, many women who I met them who think they, or parents, I say mothers because the literature focuses on mothers, but yeah, no, I mean, parents who think are bad parents, that's devastating. And children who think they didn't have enough parental love. I teach many of these students, first years at the university, are devastated, you know? So there is a lot of suffering and pain. Maybe we should end up on a more positive note. So,
Any other questions? Particularly positive one?
Yeah. Say something positive or tell us some story that is, you know. No. I'm looking at I don't want to leave anyone out. If we didn't read your question, Wendy or I, and you want to either retype it or, raise your hand and say it, please. Have we covered everyone?
I think maybe we've covered it. Oh, someone.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. So it's a half-formulated thought. So if it's incoherent, I apologize. But there's, it seems that what you're criticizing is two-pronged. On one side is the need of the community that raises the child. In our society, is the mother, because of all the political, economical, strict constraints of capital and the nuclear family. And in our society is much more communal, and they adapt to raising children based on their needs. And many of the examples that you gave of people who actively do not attach is because of scarcity or infant mortality or many other conditions that are difficult. So those are the needs of the adults in the way they're going to raise their children. But then the other side is, what do the children actually need? Right? And a healthy child is so hard to define because it's socially and culturally defined what a healthy psyche is. But I am left with that question of two questions. One, so how to define health, even though it's defined culturally in each society, how to understand what children actually really need within any parameters of what we consider health. I mean, it seems that you're tending towards, it takes a village to raise a child, or African proverb. And then the reality that in this society is so atomized that it is usually women, and more single women also, who are raising children and taking care of children. And so I'm kind of left, wondering about all of that. What about the need of the child in general, and then seeing the reality that we're in? I don't know if that made any sense.
Yeah, it made a lot of sense, but you raise very difficult issues. But as you say, the needs of the child are paramount, right? And because obviously if you have children, I mean, you're responsible for children, right? These are infants. I mean, we are a species where the babies don't, are born and can survive for themselves. But I think what this, and that's why Bowlby said, Bowlby often said, oh, I'm only criticized by the communists and the feminists, but that's because they are ignoring the needs of the child. Well, and even at some point, the feminist movement said we are living, we are moving towards equality in, child rearing. We are forgetting the needs of the child. Well, of course, it is true that if children needed mothers 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, all days of the year, if you have children, you will have to do it, right? I mean, it would be a little bit overwhelming, but maybe, your responsibility, if you brought a life to it, maybe, So the needs of the child, I'm not disregarding, but I think what the literature in other countries shows is that when other communities raise their children in other ways, not that where the mothers are not on top of the child all day, nothing bad happens to those children. They are not emotionally or psychologically damaged in any way. So it may be, as you say, that, okay, maybe they do it because those communities, because they all need to work. It may be out of necessity, but whether it is out of necessity or of choice, the children are not less healthy and less happy than Western children. So I think that's, but also that what you raise is also a very difficult question, because when you say, "Yo, what is it?" It's very difficult to know what a happy child is, and that is absolutely true. But I mean, we as society, and that's why child development sciences or attachment theory, all these theories are not only descriptive but prescriptive and normative, because you can only say, okay, the child is developing well or not well if you have a view of what the end point is, right? I mean, if I just start walking now after my talk, I mean, am I going the right way or the wrong way? Well, it depends on where I'm going, right? So when you talk about child development, any theories of development that you put forward are already, in this sense, normative, because you have to start with a view of what a good child, in the sense of a healthy or happy. You say happy. Happy is even a more complex word, right? Because what does happy mean? My youngest niece is unhappy now because she doesn't have an iPad with a pen. Well, does that mean I should buy the iPad? No, because does that mean there is a biological need for an iPad? No, she's really unhappy because in the society and that she lives, the kids her age have an iPad. So happiness is a really even much more difficult concept that is not clear that is the goal or should be the goal. But health and what is normal in psychological and emotional development requires that we have some sense of where we are going, if we are going to say these are the stages and this is what the child needs. But it's very difficult to say what that endpoint should be. It's prescriptive, as Hannah emphasized too. These are normative and prescriptive theories. And once you introduce that, we should be very careful, because this is not like, if I write a boring book, nobody buys it. Okay, too bad. But if you get it wrong, this, as somebody asked, there are people who are suffering, the children and the parents and the rest of the, siblings and community. So when, I mean, in my view, the moral, the ethical and the epistemological standards to put forward theories that are descriptive and prescriptive, not only descriptive, but prescriptive of child development and child rearing should be very high, because the stakes are very high.
Well, thank you.
Maybe
Thank
that's
you
a good point to end. Just that we
I
need
think
to
so.
I mean, there is now a very big movement in science to call for humility. The one thing that we need, and in science, when we put forward our views, is rather than claim the universality, and there is perhaps to be humble and to recognize that our views may change and need to be constantly discussed and revised. And on that note,
Excellent.
thanks for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Marga. That was really fantastic. We'll be meeting next week to begin the second section, which is on the securitized outside world. So please join us. We have the pleasure of hosting Inderpol Greywall, and we will post the readings in the drive. So thank you so much, Marga. That was fantastic. We really...
just quickly, somebody
Yes.
said that they hadn't read about the mothers, Harlow mothers who became damn good mothers. I do talk about that in my book, the first one, but I also have a couple of articles on Harlow. I don't have the reference here, but if you just Google my name, I mean, they will come up. Okay.
We can send them around as well and post them to the
Thank
Google
you
Drive.
all for you.
Thank
coming.
you. Thank you so much.
Bye now.
Thank
Have
you.
a nice afternoon.
Bye. Thank you.